Good morning, everybody. 8:37 on WMAL, where Washington comes to talk. It's Brian and Larry in the house after a little time off. Glad to be back in the saddle with you, Larry.
Maybe one of us had some time off.
Well, well, it's true. I guess, you got some time coming, though, don't you? Hey, besides all that, on the line right now is Eli Lake, one of the top national security reporters in the country today. And Eli, thanks for joining us here on this Monday morning.
Thank you very much. I'm talking to you from Cape Cod.
Wow, good for you.
Oh, man, everybody's
getting a little vacation time, a little vacay. Well, listen, you've written an interesting article that says that, look, the Obama administration, they got a lot of warnings about this uprise of ISIS and the deterioration of the situation in Iraq. And they continually seem to ignore that. And can you explain, and you've done some great reporting on this, why is it that they seem to ignore this thing that had red flags and flares going up everywhere?
Well, it wasn't just ignoring the signs on ISIS. It was also there were a lot of people who were reporting, including the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, who were saying the Iraqi military is not up to the task they will not be able to hold against a full kind of assault from this group, and that they were also being warned about the political deterioration. And I think the problem was that the White House did not really have a great silver bullet policy option. On the one hand, if they were, since January, Maliki has been asking directly for airstrikes. Since November, in his meeting with the White House on November 1, he's been asking for some U.S. military involvement in helping to select and come up with intelligence for those targets. And the problem is that if Obama agrees to that back in November, he is strengthening a prime minister who is, being called by his rivals and even a lot of Shia as the Shia Saddam, in that, Maliki has really become an autocrat and has exacerbated his political problems, which have created the conditions where Sunni tribal leaders, former Ba'athist military types, have joined this jihadist lunatic organization. And so, as Petraeus said in 2007 and 2008, the real problem with the insurgency in Iraq is a political problem, and we need to figure out a way that the Sunni minority can join the government and end their insurrection. So if you help Maliki against the immediate sort of the closest wolf to the sled, which is ISIS, you end up further strengthening his hand as he goes in this direction that alienates 20% of his population. And so with that, I think there was a real stasis. There was a paralysis of the policy process. And the situation got worse and worse and worse, and now we are where we are.
And we're not helping, and even though the State Department says, we're doing what we can, compared to the other nations in the area, we're not helping much. According to the Iraqi ambassador, they are now turning to Russia, Syria, and Iran for help. And what does that do to our relationship with that country and all of the investment that we made in trying to secure that country in the region there?
Well, it's again, the problem is that Obama's approach to Iraq has been fraught with a paradox. It has withdrawn the last American troops. It failed to secure an extension to the status of forces agreement. And in so doing, it in a lot of ways, at least from the White House perspective, Iraq is the last administration's problem. Nonetheless, it continued to sell nearly $11 billion worth of advanced military equipment to the Iraqi military, which a lot of people said, okay, that's a good idea. It's not just money for our defense industry, but it's also a way for the United States to continue to have leverage with the Iraqi government. But that leverage was never really used in a way that would have led to a more constructive outcome politically. So again, it wasn't entirely the case that Obama was, free of Iraq and wasn't supporting Maliki. The White House and the administration lobbied Congress to approve the sale of Apache helicopters, but it wasn't willing to do the kinds of things, in terms of putting more personnel in Iraq, earlier having more advisors to the key national security institutions, and encouraging Maliki to hire back the competent military commanders and to stop stacking that military with yes men who were really political cronies, which I think is one of the key causes for the collapse of the military in Mosul.
All right, so let's just step back for a moment, because a lot of Americans, don't pay close attention to what goes on overseas, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's just, that's some other place. It doesn't impact my life. Bring it into terms that everybody can understand. Why should we as Americans care about this deteriorating situation in Iraq?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first is because right now, absolute barbaric jihadists have taken over a swath of land the size of Indiana between Syria and Iraq. That's a safe haven. If they're allowed to have and keep that and go on unmolested, then that is a situation that's very similar to what we saw in Afghanistan before 9/11, except it's even worse because it's in the middle of the Middle East and it's close to the sort of center of the world energy market. I think the second reason that Americans ought to care is because Iraq was not hopeless. It wasn't simply that they never had a chance. There was an opportunity, particularly because of what's known as the surge or the counterinsurgency plan, for Iraq to become a model and to continue to have successive elections and to show that politics is a far better way than civil war to settle these kinds of confessional differences. And that's something that not only benefits the United States, it benefits the region, it benefits the world. And I think that Iraq had a chance. A lot of the blame here is that Nouri al-Maliki turned out to be a pretty terrible leader, and everybody now recognizes that. And so you can't put this all on the U.S. or Obama or Bush or anything like that. Maliki made his own decisions, and that was pretty bad. But there was a point when the United States could have exercised far more influence, and it chose not to exercise that influence, and instead to treat Iraq like it was any other nation, and it wasn't there. And I think the other thing is because it's good for the United States when they create and they sustain relationships with these militaries. And Iraq was a military that fought with the United States against al-Qaeda. That's a pretty good ally to have if you think you're in a long war. But I think the evidence now shows that Obama doesn't want to be in that long war, and that relationship has really withered, and that's really a shame, I think.
Right, and Eli Lake, bringing it back to domestic politics right here inside the Beltway, it almost seems as no matter how bad the news is from Iraq, the Obama administration's position seems to be, well, the original sin was George Bush taking us into Iraq, so at this point, anything bad that happens, we're absolved, and it all goes back to Bush-Cheney.
Well, I mean, in response to that, I think that's going to be debated. I think the majority of Americans supported in 2003 the invasion of Iraq, and now the majority of Americans, by a lot, say that that was a mistake. But that said, look at the situation. I mean, if you're going to argue that, you have to say, all right, well then it would have been better had Iraq remained a kind of the personal property of Saddam Hussein or his sons. Are you assuming then that Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist tyranny would have suppressed all of the kind of, rage and, everything that we're seeing right now in Syria? I mean, it was, Bashar Assad, who was also a Ba'athist dictator, he failed to kind of keep that tamped down. Would Saddam have succeeded? And if Saddam had succeeded, I think it's an important question to ask, as Americans, and rather, is the world willing to tolerate that kind of brutal tyranny as the price of stability, assuming that you would have gotten that stability anyway? Those were the questions that faced policymakers in 2003. That's what faced the George W. Bush administration. Right. And, I think that, you have to put it in that context before you say, it was terrible. Certainly, lots and lots of mistakes were made. The decommissioning of the Iraqi military, you can go on and on and on. The case of WMD, which were not there. All of that, I mean, they deserve a lot of blame. The Bush administration. So it's not to sort of get them off the hook, but you have to put it in the context.
Right.
What was the alternative? Would it have been better?
Thank you, Eli Lake.
We're going to have to leave it right there, Eli. Thank you so much.